Welcome to Understanding Biblical Prophecy. I am Reverend Howard Sloan, and we are going to be talking about biblical prophecy, particularly Old Testament prophecy, and how best to understand that, dealing with some of the issues, and then how do we apply that. So we're going to divide our study up into 4 sessions. The first session will cover misconceptions and the idea of what is prophecy and what's the prophet's task. The second session will talk about forms of biblical prophecy. The third, we'll talk about discovering meaning in the prophets. And then finally, we will talk about making application. So what are the basic misconceptions that people have about biblical prophecy? Well, one is that prophecy is primarily about foretelling the future. When we think of a prophet, we think of somebody who looks deeply into the spiritual realm and is able to see things that have yet to take place. But that is not really how we ought to look at, or at least primarily how we ought to look at biblical prophecy. The reason we often do this is because we want to know the future. We want to know what's going to happen. Interpreters especially often focus on Old Testament prophets' predictions of the Messiah. We look at things in the prophets that pointed to Jesus. But when we do that, we miss the larger context. Especially when we do focus on what the Old Testament prophets have to say about our future. The truth is that they have very little to say about our future. And the other is when we try to make it say things that it just simply doesn't say. Here's one example from Richard Pratt. He said, I remember one time being in the Ukraine talking about some other subject, and a fellow in the back of the room lifted his hand up and said, do you think that the meltdown at Chernobyl is a sign of the end of time? That Jesus is coming back very soon? I thought for sure it had been mistranslated, but I wasn't getting the point across. But I looked over at the pastor, and he said, did he say what I think he said? The pastor explained to me that Chernobyl means wormwood, and the dialect there. In Jeremiah it says, in the latter days there will be wormwood. So this fellow had lifted the verse out of the book of Jeremiah. Chernobyl had melted down, and therefore he saw it as a sign of the end of time. This is the kind of thing that we often do, especially when we don't understand context. And some of the other things we'll get to in a moment. Using the prophets in this way is highly selective. Consider the following statistics. This is from Fee and Stuart, How to Read the Bible for All Its Worth. Less than 2% of the Old Testament prophecy is messianic. Less than 5% specifically describes the New Covenant age. Less than 1% concerns events yet to come. So this leads us to 2 questions. What is prophecy, and what is the prophet's task? So let's look at that. What is prophecy, and what is the prophet's task? First thing we need to remember is that the prophet's primary task is forthtelling, not foretelling. The prophet's primary task is forthtelling, not foretelling. It's a subtle difference. It's a very subtle difference. It's only a few letters different. But there's a big difference between forthtelling and foretelling. Prophets are covenant spokesmen. We must remember that first of all, which means that when we talk about them being covenant spokesmen, it means sometimes that they will be foretelling the future, but it always means that they speak for God. It isn't that the prophet never speaks about events yet to come, but it is that always they are speaking on behalf of God, whether they are giving warnings, encouragement, whether they are talking about things that will happen as a result of a punishment, or they're talking about things that God will do to redeem his people. The bigger picture is that they are always speaking for God. They're often seen, according to Fee and Stuart, as covenant enforcement mediators. They talk about when the covenant relationship between them and God has been broken, largely when they are disobedient. What is God going to do? He points out their sins. He points out how they have failed to keep the covenant. And so they are the ones who are there to tell the people that they have broken God's covenant. Van Stuart go on to say, thus God does not merely give Israel his law, but he enforces it. This is where the prophets come in. God announced the enforcement, positive or negative, of his law through them, so that the events of blessing and cursing would be clearly understood